Hi, this is Tony Agnesi, and welcome to this edition of the StoryTellers. This is episode 12 of our third season of the StoryTellers. It debuts on Wednesday evenings at 6 p.m. on the Fiat Ministry Network, and then is played later that evening on the Patchwork Heart Ministry Network and on my YouTube page at Tony Agnesi. The radio program is produced for its third year now on the Living Bread Radio Network and airs on the Living Bread Radio Network stations. Each week on the program, we feature an inspirational guest and discuss not only their personal faith journeys and the ministries they share as authors, as speakers, bloggers, and radio and television hosts. And today we have not only a fascinating topic, but a fascinating speaker as well. Jim Bertrand is a certified presenter of the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud. And we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. He has done literally hundreds of talks in 17 or 18 different dioceses on the Shroud of Turin. And for those people who find that subject, as I do, fascinating, you're going to enjoy this half hour. Jim, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on the StoryTellers.
Well, good day to you too, Tony, and thank you for that kind introduction.
You know, for those people, and I'm sure we have a few people who are unfamiliar with the Shroud, give us a little background to kind of set the stage, if you will, for our discussion today.
Sure. What we're talking about is a Jewish burial cloth. And the Jews have been burying their dead the same way for thousands of years. They place them in a single cloth, sometimes linen, usually linen, sometimes cotton, or sometimes even other material. But it's placed lengthwise so that the one end is at the feet, the other end is wrapped around the head, and then they're lowered. They put a single strip usually and wrap it. They see a 15-foot long piece of cloth to tie it off at the neck, a couple times around the body, and tie it at the feet so that the linen stays on the body. And the Shroud of Turin is the dimensions that would fit such an item, and it has an image of a crucified man on it. It's 8 cubits by 2 cubits, which is exactly 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. And there's a very, very faint superficial image of which we can't explain of a man who's been crucified and scourged with a lance wound and blood stains around the head from a cap of thorns. And the tradition has passed down through the centuries that this was the burial cloth of Christ, that this was indeed the cloth what John and Peter saw when they looked into the tomb on Easter morning and saw and believed. So the thing we're talking about is called the Shroud of Turin. It didn't come to Turin until 1578. Before that time, it was known as the image not made by human hands, or the sacred burial syndone of Christ. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah, a lot of people might wonder, and I'm sure the question comes up often. You probably have had it asked a number of times. Okay, well then, how did it get from the burial spot of Jesus? What kind of a journey did it have to go through to finally end up in that 14th century in the town of Turin, Italy?
Sure. Well, that's a fascinating question, and that where has it gone over the centuries? From about the year 1355 till the present, its presence is very well documented. In 1355, it was up in Lille, France. It was played for some 40,000 people. And later on, it was transferred to the House of Savoy in 1453. And that dynasty began in the 10th century and lasted to the 20th century. And then later, it crossed from France into Italy in 1578 and it restored the Turin Cathedral, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And that's where it has been ever since. Now, before that time, we just pick it up on Easter morning. Okay, Peter and John looked in and saw and believed. We don't have a nice, accurate record of, gee, where was it day by day for the next, 13 centuries or so. But that makes sense because you wouldn't expect it to be well advertised. If its whereabouts had been advertised, it certainly would have been confiscated and destroyed. But we do have reference to a document that St. Jerome saw. St. Jerome translated the Bible into the Latin Vulgates in the 4th century. He held in his hand a parchment that explained how Peter brought with it, the high priest brought with him the sacred burial linen of our Lord to Antioch. We know from the Acts of the Apostles, there was a persecution in Jerusalem in 44 AD. And the apostles spread out. Peter went to Antioch. It's believed he took it with him, and that it stayed there for about 5 centuries. And then in 540, Antioch was attacked. By the way, Antioch is a very important city. That's where St. Luke was from. He wrote the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Luke, a very important Christian community. And in 540, it was attacked by the Persians. And shortly after that, it appears in central Turkey, in a place called Anatolia, the city called Kamaliana. And in 570, and by about this time is when we get the first picture that seems to match up very well with the shroud. If you think of icons, the Russian icons and icons from the Catholic Church, most people would recognize that picture. I show you a small one here for our YouTube audience. It looks like, okay, that.
There we go.
People on the radio, you're just going to have to imagine that. Sorry about that. And this picture matches up with over 150 points of congruence from the shroud. The only difference is in this picture, the eyes are open. On the shroud, the eyes are closed. Well, in 574, the emperor of Constantinople had the shroud brought to Constantinople, and it stayed there until the year 1204, the Fourth Crusades. Now, there's another theory that said that it passed from Jerusalem to Edessa, and that was very commonly read about in the news. It was proposed by Ian Wilson back in the 1970s, but in light of more recent scholarship from Dr. Jack Marquardt, it seems to be leaning more toward Antioch than Edessa, but that's an open question. There are 5 or 6 areas of the shroud that are open on that. Well, basically, long story short, in 1204 was the sack of Constantinople, and that is where the shroud disappears for 150 years. It's called the missing years until it turns up in Berry, France in 1255. So in Shroud International conferences today, when papers are presented, those are the 2 areas that are talked about. One is its history, especially the missing years. And secondly, how was the image formed? Because it's such a mysterious image that we cannot duplicate. There's no paint or pigment on it. There's no stuff to make the image. It's just there somehow in a very superficial way.
Yeah, well, you're walking right into my next question. And is how could this be formed? Is it sweat? Is it there's nothing there that would cause this image that is discernible from just looking at it. What are some of the theories that have been laid out over the course of the years?
Well, there have been 10 that have been published in scientific literature over the last century. We could divide those into 3 categories. The first category was, could this be a natural process? Like if the body just lays in a cloth, will this just happen naturally? And those have been ruled out because of some problems. Like you mentioned, sweaty face. If it was simply sweat going from the face onto the cloth, remember the body's 3-dimensional, and you would have a wraparound distortion because from ear to ear, it's about a foot, and that face would be a foot wide if it was just wrapped. So the image was not formed by direct contact with sweat. So we know it's not a natural process, and there's been some experiments to verify that. The second category, there have been 6 theories about artist theories. Was it a hot statue they placed this on? Again, you got the wraparound distortion problem. Was it a painting? Did someone invent photography back in the 13th century and not cash in on it until we discovered it in the 1800s? All of those artist theories have failed to account for some of the characteristics of the shroud. I'll give you a couple here. There are 17 traits about the shroud that we know of, and any type of image formation process has to account for all of those. One of them is that there's no side images. And so, gee, how could that be? Another one is it is so superficial. When one is close to the shroud, say within 4 or 5 feet of the actual shroud, you cannot see the image. All right. The reason you see it in replicas is because replicas are made on 4-foot printers with dye, and the dye soaks all the way through the thread. So you're seeing threads that are soaked. Now, the shroud will show blood stains and water stains, and those things that have soaked all the way through the thread. But the image itself is on the very uppermost portion. To give you an idea how small this is, if you think of right now on your shirt, there's probably a button, and if you look at one of those threads, that's how fine the shroud is. It's 1/3 of a millimeter thick. Okay, tinier than a paperclip. It's extremely fine. And that one thread is made up of anywhere from 70 to 120 microfibers. Now, under the microscope, if we look for the image-bearing threads, we find that this yellowing effect only penetrates about 2/10 of 1 micron. And to give you an idea of that, there are 1,000 microns in a millimeter.
In a
A
millimeter.
millimeter is about the size of a paperclip. Imagine 1,000 of that thickness, right? And then 2/10 of that. It's called superficiality. And this is simply that one of the traits that all of the artist theories have failed to account for, as well as many other traits that they can't account for as well. Another one, the other third category is what we would call a radiation event. We call that the resurrection, if you will. Was there some type of radiant event in which energy burst from the body and somehow put this image on there superficially, whether it was photons of light or electrons from a coronal discharge or photons in a type of, or neutrons from a neutron flux. The most popular of these theories, that the one that explains all 17 traits, in fact, the only theory that can explain all 17 traits of the shroud, is what's called the fall-through hypothesis, proposed by Dr. John Jackson in 1989, and it does satisfy all of those main traits on the shroud. Basically, imagine if there was a burst of light coming from the body, and in one instant, this huge surge of energy, and the body simultaneously becomes mechanically transparent, and the cloth would collapse through the body, pulling out at the sides as it goes. Imagine where the nose is in contact with the cloth. Okay, coming down from the top down, it pulls out and it collapses through this body in the plane of gravity. And this would account for what we see on the shroud of the face with no side images and no distortions, no wraparound distortions. And there's something else that's very peculiar in that in those points of the body that were most in intimate contact with the cloth, they show a darker yellowing. And the parts that are further away, say, for example, the eyes, they're a couple millimeters away from the cloth at the instant of image formation, they're darker. And there is a direct proportional correlation between the cloth to the body distance at the moment of image formation. So when you see a picture of the shroud in a photographic negative, you see much more of the details, but there's a direct correlation there. It even shows that one of the cheeks was swollen. I don't know if for your Zoom, for your people watching on YouTube here, on the two cheeks there, one of those cheeks has been examined by the forensic pathologist from Los Angeles County. And the cheek is swollen because it's lighter in color on the photographic negative. It's darker on the shroud. And so that cheek indicates that it was tighter up against the cloth because it was swollen. And so the face is asymmetrical. And interestingly, the face on the pantocrator icon, that icon made in 550 AD, is also asymmetrical, showing that. And there's a portion of the beard that is missing, all right? And if you think of Isaiah 50, he said, I gave my back to those who beat me. You see the scourge marks. My cheeks to those who pulled my beard. Part of the beard is missing. And my face I did not shield from buffets. Those elements of Isaiah chapter 50 are physically manifested on the Shroud of Turin.
The other question, and I know when you hear about the shroud in modern times here, it generally surrounds some question of carbon dating and trying to pinpoint, Jim, is this old enough to go back to Christ and so forth? I know there were some people that thought it might be, old, but not that old. Tell us a little bit about the carbon dating research that's been done on the shroud here in modern times.
Right. Well, carbon dating has been used for a few decades now, and it's been used in the scientific world because you basically look at the ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14, and that gives you an idea of the age. So it's still used today. However, there is a problem with contamination. Other contaminants, if other carbon gets into it, and that throws off that ratio of carbon-12 to 14. And more carbon-14 makes it look younger than it actually is. And this happens in about 20% carbon dating tests. One out of every five is thrown out. And so contamination is a very real problem. Well, in the 1988 test, there were 3 laboratories that were given a sample from the shroud, one in Tucson, Arizona, one from Oxford, England, one from Zurich, Switzerland. And Michael Tite of the Oxford laboratory, he was in charge of, actually he was in charge of the British Museum of Natural History. He was in charge of overseeing the test. There were 15 protocols that had been agreed on in the months and years before this test. And all 15 were violated in that test. They were supposed to take samples from 3 different sites on the shroud. And instead it came from just one site in the lower right-hand corner by the right foot, which was where it was normally held. It was held by people to display. It was later determined that the most contaminated, worst possible location that could have been chosen. And that was the only site that was chosen. And it's darkened because of handling, not because of a fire or anything like that. And those samples were all about the size of your thumbnail. And those were published in 1989. I won't go through the 15 protocols that were violated, but there was the information leaked out. There was data sharing between the labs that were supposed to be confidential, that they were talking about this kind of thing. Anyway, when that came out in 1989, it indicated that carbon dating, say, about 1325, plus or minus 65 years. And so that made headlines, of course, the shroud is a hoax and so forth. Well, right away, some other scientists started looking at some of the data that was published in Nature magazine, published this, and they found there were some errors, some significant errors, in such that every inch of the cloth gets a century younger as you go from the outside of the cloth to the inside of the cloth. At that rate, it would be thousands of years into the future. So it was suspect and challenged from the very beginning, but it could never be proven because the labs did not publish their raw data. They didn't publish what the machines actually said. Well, there's something called the Freedom of Information Act. Mm-hmm. It's an international law, and a European by the name of Tristan Casabianca was able to invoke that law, and the courts opened, of course, the labs to share their data. And indeed, when the true data was shown in 2019, the discrepancy between this cloth that was supposed to be adjacent to each other, all these little pieces, were so heterogeneous and disparate that they did what's called a chi-square test on it. What are the chances of that happening? Almost infinitesimal. It's called significant deviation. There's acceptable deviation, you can be off a little bit, and then there's significant deviation. This showed significant deviation. So the test was always suspect, but it was proven to be invalid in 2019. So in the scientific world, the carbon dating test of 1988 is no longer an issue. But my guess is among the general population, there are people that probably think that it's still an undecided 50-50 thing. Yeah. It's simply not the case.
Let's talk a little bit about what makes the shroud so relevant today, and why are so many people inviting you to speak? What is the attraction in 2020 of the Shroud of Turin?
Sure. Well, many people have had a difficult year of living in isolation, living in fear. And when we get so distracted by, the moment-to-moment things that we're going through, we lose track of the big picture. Where am I going? Well, I'm going towards eternity. We're going to step into eternity. And what the shroud does is it provides this very real cloth with a real image of who we believe to be Christ. And by the way, he was 5 feet 10 inches, about 170 pounds. It makes Christ very real. I gave this to a seminary once. Seminarians came up, and of course, all of them believe in the real presence, of course, but to see the man on the shroud, and that it was real blood, and all of those things that go along with that, it just reinforces for them, the resurrection of Christ. And this image, we believe, the tomb was empty. Why? We believe that Christ rose from the dead. So the shroud is a sign of hope. And when we see the image on the shroud, we consider the reality of the resurrection, because you see, our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection and not on the authenticity of the shroud. Okay, but the fact that the two may, both complement each other should be all the more reason to give us hope that sure, we may be going through tough times now, but in the end, we're going to step into eternity and hopefully be in eternity united with God. So there's a great sign of hope.
Jim Bertrand is my guest. Jim, what's fascinating to me, tell us a little bit about your background, preparing you to do the work you do with speaking and touring with the Shroud, the subject of the Shroud. But how is how has it affected your own personal faith journey with all the knowledge you've gained on the Shroud? Has that had a personal effect on your faith journey?
Yeah, you got a few questions there, the background and then the effect on me. I would say that the majesty of this space and the fact that after studying it for some 30 years, seeing that a natural process is ruled out, it just doesn't happen on its own. You can see more of these. And secondly, all of the artist theories that fail to account for all of these unique characteristics. There's 3D information on the Shroud as well. I've got time to go through 17 grades. So if you rule out an artist's drawing, if you rule out a natural process, what's left? What's left is a supernatural event of the resurrection, perhaps caused by a burst of light, a rise in Christ. And if you think about that, we all are familiar with, I talked about the mechanically transparent body. If there was a burst of light coming from the body and it collapses through this mechanically transparent body, think how Jesus appeared to the apostles on Easter night. They're locked in the upper room, right? And he comes among them. How could that be? Well, if he had a resurrected body, it was a transparent body, no longer subject to the laws of nature, and so the door presented no obstacle for him. So then, okay, so we accept on faith that he appeared to the apostles on Easter night. Then the question becomes, when did that moment begin that his body acquired this unique ability? Well, if it occurred at the instant of the resurrection, then this would account for a vertically aligned 3D image with no side images for the entire body. From head to foot, there's no side images in a very, very superficial way. To give you an idea of how much energy we're talking about, several physicists have written on this and published papers. It would require every laser on Earth to be concentrated on this cloth for 40 nanoseconds, which is 40 billionths of 1 second. So it's an instant that is just so minute that we can't imagine someone trying to pull that off. And so all of that light and all of that brief period of time could somehow perhaps dehydrate the fibers and cause them to yellow to leave this image of 2 tenths of an inch. So the effect on me is that I believe in the resurrection with or without the Shroud. But with the Shroud, I think maybe God has given it to us for a reason to strengthen our faith and certainly give us a reason for hope. My background, Tony, I've been teaching high school science for 39 years. I've taught biology for 32 years at the high school level, and I taught physics and chemistry the last 7 years. So that's where I'm coming from on that. And back in 1981 is when I first got interested in the Shroud. There was National Geographic magazine presented this article on Dr. Jackson's research. In 1978, there were 33 scientists he led. And they studied the Shroud for 120 consecutive hours. Around the clock, there was always several scientists working on it. To this day, that remains the most comprehensive, factual survey we've ever done on the Shroud. And they were trying to answer the question, how was the image formed? After 3 years of publishing their data, they could not answer that question, but they did determine these 3 facts. Number 1 is that it is not a painting. Number 2, there's no paint, there's no pigments or dyes, it's not the work of an artist. And number 3, there's no physical means that can account for the totality of this image. And so that kind of hooked me in terms of, wow, how else to explain this? This could be a real thing. And so studying it for years, in 1996, I invited Dr. John Jackson to come speak in my parish. And so he went from Colorado Springs to Lincoln, Nebraska, and he gave a presentation at the St. Peter Parish. We became friends, we hosted him, and we stayed in touch over the years. And he has about more than 4 decades of research that's been combined into a book called The Shroud of Turin, Critical Sin. And this book was basically assembled and edited by an engineer named Robert Seeker, a very good friend of mine. And they invited me to come to the Turin Shroud Conference in St. Louis, Missouri, an international conference in 2014. And at the end of seeing all of those 42 papers presented by scientists, they asked me, could you take this book, it's 134 pages, and could you put it into a PowerPoint that we can share with people? And I agreed to that, and I started working on that November of 2014, actually October of 2014. I've been doing it ever since. And I have to tell you, Tony, that the foundation of this is really prayer. My first 7 presentations were to religious communities. And as I shared this PowerPoint with them, the nuns and sisters, I asked them to pray for me on Fridays. So they prayed for me on Fridays. And that's kind of the foundation that's lifted me up and opened doors in other venues, high schools, universities, college settings. I've given them in men's and women's prisons, lunch groups, just you name it, and all kinds of people. The Shroud appeals to everyone. It really does.
We're almost out of time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity here before we run out of time of how if somebody who is watching or listening wants to make get you to make a presentation in their state or their parish or for their organization, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, I don't have a personal website, but I can give you my email, and that's usually the way it works. They send me an email, and they invite me out, and I come out and give the presentation. And I don't make a dime from this, Tony. I've been doing this for years. I don't make any money at all. Ask people to cover my travel, and I come sometimes stay in post homes. And then if they want to make a donation to the confraternity, they may. But whatever amount they're comfortable with, we're comfortable with. That email address is bsaints2@gmail.com. BBSAINTS2@gmail.com. And they can reach me there for information.
Jim, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a fascinating half hour, and I really enjoyed it. That's our show for today. My thanks to Jim Bertrand and the fascinating subject of the Shroud of Turin for being with us today. The program premieres at 6 p.m. on Wednesday evenings at the Fiat Ministry Network, later at Patchwork Heart Ministries, and on my YouTube page at Tony Agnesi. The radio program is produced by the Living Bread Radio Network, and it airs Sunday at 4 p.m. on the Living Bread Radio Network stations. And at 4:30, it'll be on the StoryTellersRadio.com, and later that week on the Catholic podcasting site, breadboxmedia.com. It's available where all your podcasts are, or you can get it at Spotify and Google+, Apple, and so forth. That's our show for today. I'll see you again next week with another episode of The Storytellers. This is Tony Agnesi. God bless you.